Okay, so our panelists today are Rosalyn Deutsche and Olivia Custer. Rosalyn will speak first. She's the author of a book that was really, I think, crucial for many of us in starting to think about art, architecture, public space, what she called spatial politics, and questions about democracy and rights together in an interesting way called Evictions. More recently, she delivered the Wellick Lectures at Irvine, and they were published under the title Hiroshima After Iraq, another excellent book, smaller than the first book.
Very small.
Yeah. Olivia, she teaches in art history at Barnard in New York. Olivia Custer has been our colleague at Bard in human rights and philosophy. She's the author of a book which sadly isn't available in English, a great book on Kant and the question of the example. But maybe one day it will be available in English. So, Rosalyn, pleased to have you.
Thank you. I want to thank the organizers, Tirdad and Tom and Suhail, wherever he is. There he is. For inviting me and the staff for being incredibly hospitable. I'm having a great time. My talk is called, as you can see, Unwar, an Aesthetic Sketch. Attempts to abolish war, not a particular war, but war as a social institution, are often dismissed as utopian idealism, wild fantasies far removed from the realm of real politics. War, we are told, is inevitable. Humans are territorial and predatory beings. Besides, there's always been war. Who can forget the opening pages of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, where the narrator says that he's writing an anti-war novel, and his interlocutor replies, "You know what I say to people when I hear they're writing anti-war books? I say, why don't you write an anti-glacier book instead?" What he meant, of course, the narrator explains, was that there would always be wars, that they were as easy to stop as glaciers. Of course, that was before global warming. Still, Krzysztof Wodiczko fearlessly pursues perpetual peace in an ongoing aesthetic project titled the Arc de Triomphe, World Institute for the Abolition of War, and in a book, The Abolition of War, which documents, contextualizes, and theorizes the work. Introduced in Harvard Design Magazine in 2010, World Institute is a proposal to attach a transparent, scaffold-like structure to the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Traditional historical monuments like the Parisian Arc embody what Friedrich Nietzsche called monumental history, and Walter Benjamin famously denounced as the history of the victors, the past narrated as a progression of supposedly eternal great moments. Therefore, all traditional monuments, whether or not they overtly commemorate war, can be considered war memorials. However, the neoclassical Arc de Triomphe is not only an explicit war memorial, a permanent insult to the vanquished by the victors. That's a quote from the Paris Commune before they demolished the column, in the Vendôme column. Not only an explicit war memorial, but an especially hyperbolic example of the genre. Until 1982, the Arc de Triomphe was the largest triumphal arch in the world, and its immensity, coupled with its triumphalist patriotic messages, made it the standard for modern public monuments. Commissioned in 1806 and completed in 1836, modeled on the Roman Arch of Titus, the Arc glorifies revolutionary and Napoleonic conquests. For many years, it served as the rallying point of French troops parading after successful military campaigns. Beneath the ark lies the tomb of the unknown soldier from World War I, the war to end all wars, installed on Armistice Day in 1920, accompanied by the first eternal flame lit in Europe since the 4th century, and by a typically nationalistic inscription, "Here lies a French soldier who died for the fatherland, 1914 to 1918. As the linchpin of the city's sequence of monuments and grand thoroughfares known as the historical axis, the Ark now occupies a central place in both Paris and the European Union. The Ark is adorned with 30 shields inscribed with the names of 96 revolutionary and Napoleonic military victories, allegorical and historical friezes, an engraved list of French victories and of 660 soldiers and generals who fought in French victories, as well as 4 enormous sculptural reliefs, including most famously, where am I? Francois Rude's bellicose La Marseillaise, featuring a wild-eyed winged victory wearing a helmet crowned by furies. The chronological order of the reliefs, advancing from departure to triumph to resistance to peace, suggests that war can produce peace. Wodiczko approaches the Arc de Triomphe not only as a symbol, but also as a symptom of our culture of war. The motivation to fight and die in war, he writes, is perpetuated by a culture of war that manifests itself through uniforms, war games, parades, military decorations, and war memorials, including statues and shrines, triumphal arches, cenotaphs, victory columns, and other commemorations of the dead, the creation of war art and military art, martial music, and war museums, and the popular fascination with weapons, war toys, violent video and computer games, battle reenactments, collectibles, and military history and literature. That's the end of the quote from Wodiczko. However, these undisguised expressions of warlike culture are only the tip of the iceberg. For, as Virginia Woolf demonstrated in 3 Guineas, her feminist anti-war essay of 1938, the culture of war takes more insidious and therefore more dangerous forms. It's perpetuated, for instance, in the customs of the most esteemed professions of men. Distinctions of dress that indicate rank, or titles placed before or letters after names, both of which establish superiority and arouse competition, encouraging a warlike disposition, grandiose, vain, egoistic, possessive, combative. Enclosed within Wodiczko's structure, the structure is the World Institute for the Abolition of War, the Arc de Triomphe undergoes a Brechtian transformation into an extraordinary object. Remaining fully visible, but appearing isolated and entrapped, it metamorphoses into a gigantic specimen, as Wodiczko describes it, even a pathogen, which produces war as collective madness. World Institute's objective is to disarm the Ark, combining commemorative, research, educational, and proactive functions. It allows the public, as well as scholars from a variety of disciplines, to examine the memorial from new viewpoints. The Institute also houses a wide array of activities devoted to peacemaking, or what Wodiczko calls unwar, the term he prefers to peace. Peace, after all, has long coexisted with preparedness for war. According to the American philosopher William James, writing in the first decade of the 20th century, quote, "Peace, in military mouths today, is a synonym for war expected. The word has become a pure provocative, and no government wishing peace sincerely should allow it ever to be printed in a newspaper. Every up-to-date dictionary should say that peace and war mean the same thing, now in passe, now in actu. It may even be reasonably said that the intensely sharp preparation for war by the nations is the real war, permanent, unceasing, and that the battles are only a sort of public verification of the mastery gained during the peace interval, end quote. Unwar, by contrast with peace, implies disarmament, a process of undoing war, which, as we shall see, the artist understands not only as military preparedness and combat, but also as an individual and collective state of mind. Wodiczko's plan for a project to disarm the arc and the larger culture of war exhibits the same combination of practicality and vision that distinguishes his earlier works of interrogative design. This is a term that he uses for design that interrogates a society that produces injustices, such as the homeless vehicle of 1988. Like the interrogative design projects, World Institute for the Abolition of War incorporates meticulous technical drawings and other architectural renderings meant for actual use into an imaginative anticipation of a social condition that may come to be. A system of ramps, elevators, horizontal moving walkways, and vertically moving viewing platforms intersect along the outside and through the inside of the arc. I'm just going to show some renderings of the system. The circulation system allows visitors to study the arc's iconography and diagnose the war pathologies that war culture tries to repress. For instance, when standing on a platform to view at eye level the female representative of victory at the top of Rude's La Marseillaise, one can detect just how crazed she is. External and internal plasma screens and pixel boards installed throughout the scaffolding display programs related to the Institute's work and encourage visitors to stop to join discussions. Parallel to the main frieze of the arc is a continuous strip of media display panels enumerating all recorded wars, campaigns, battles, and military assaults on civilians, and listing direct and indirect human casualties. Similarly, parallel to each relief honoring a Napoleonic battle stands a list of killed and wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, and civilians. Currently, there are different designs for the World Institute. Likewise, the Institute's program is provisional. Wodiczko foresees the division of the structure's top floors into 4 informational zones, each containing audiovisual, interactive, telepresence, and immersive displays and environments. The zones, suggests the artist, might be devoted to providing information about past and present peace-building efforts, the disarmament process, the present state of world armament, multidisciplinary theoretical discourses in peace-related fields, past and present, and cultural, artistic, and pedagogical projects that have contributed to the discourse of war resistance. The program also provides for a world situation map located in the area above the roof of the arc in the central horizontal section of the upper level of the structure. Displaying the changing global dynamics of wars, conflicts, post-war, post-conflict, and peace zones, the map overhangs a large hall devoted to a discursive forum for the abolition of war, a highly mediatized space that hosts special events and global conferences. The area surrounding the discursive forum contains facilities for a cross-disciplinary Center for Global Peace Projects, which develops and implements practical programs to abolish war. World Institute for the Abolition of War aims to render the Arc de Triomphe inoperative in promoting war. But, says Vodichko, it's not enough to disarm the external culture of war. Unwar projects must also disarm the individual. One of the premises of World Institute, then, is that abolishing war is an individual responsibility. Vodichko's call for individual responsibility arises not from moralism, but from the conviction that we are each accountable for war because, as psychoanalysis teaches us, war is hidden in our unconscious minds. We are ourselves inner war memorials, the artist writes, unwittingly echoing Gertrude Stein, who in 1947 observed that while there is certainly war outside, there is also war inside. What is there inside, in one, that makes one know all about war? Stein asked. War, of course, is above all a collective phenomenon, so the notion that we are inner war memorials raises the vexed question of the relationship between war inside and war outside, between, that is, the psychical and the social realms. Is violence installed in us from within or from without? In an essay devoted to locating violence, especially sexual violence, Jacqueline Rose, quoting Wilhelm Reich, poses the question this way: where does the misery come from? Rose examines two conventional answers given to this question. One, offered by Reich, claims that violence is imposed on the individual psyche by a strictly external world that is itself untouched by psychic processes. The other answer asserts that a strictly internal psychical world causes social violence. Rose observes that the two seemingly opposing answers share a common warlike structure. Each pits inside and outside against each other in deadly combat. Consequently, these answers evade the radical ambiguity of the psychic-social relationship. Because the psychoanalytic subject is formed through relationships, and because its emergence is one and the same event with entry into the social field, there can be no bright line, no rigid polarity between internal and external worlds. Psychoanalytically speaking, then, the idea that war exists inside each of us doesn't mean, as sociologically oriented thinkers tend to assume, and as Vodichko himself sometimes seems to suggest, that an external culture of war imposes war on our minds, though this is no doubt true. Neither does it mean that the state forces us to make war, though this is also the case. Rather, it means that unconscious aggressivity, a tendency toward destructive, hostile attitudes and behaviors, arises in the individual's formative relationships and abides in human subjects, persisting throughout our lives and playing a significant role in war outside. Each individual is responsible for war in the sense of being its agent, and therefore, in an ethical universe, each individual is responsible for war in the sense of being accountable for abolishing it. So the next section of my talk is called Responsibility. Psychoanalytic literature offers many ideas about the psychic dimensions of war. In 1915, during World War I, we find Freud struggling to understand the connection between internal and external violence. expressing shock at the extreme cruelty of the war and the participating nations' lack of respect for laws of war, Freud speculated that war depends on a regression to infantile barbarism. Regression, he writes, is possible because in the development of the human mind, earlier stages persist alongside later ones. Succession involves coexistence. Normally, the capacity for barbarous deeds is held in check by the community and the state, which forbid wrongdoing, not, Freud hypothesizes, because it desires to abolish wrongdoing, but because it desires to monopolize it, like salt and tobacco. In times of war, however, the state sanctions barbaric behavior. As far as I know, the most thoroughly elaborated psychoanalytic theory of war was drafted in the 1960s by the Italian psychoanalyst Franco Fornari. Fornari was president of the Italian Psychoanalytic Society, a member of Psychoanalysts Against Nuclear War, and the figure who introduced in Italy the ideas of the British analyst Melanie Klein. In 1964, Fornari published a book titled The Psychoanalysis of Nuclear War, following it 2 years later with The Psychoanalysis of War, a book that greatly influenced Vedichko. Fornari wanted to return war to the unconscious of the individual subject while avoiding reductive approaches to the inside-outside relationship. He reassured his readers that psychoanalytic exploration, quote, is not a matter of a conflict between the traditionally recognized external causes, economic, demographic, political, ideological, of war, and its unrecognized internal causes, but rather of a shift of emphasis from the former to the latter. And further, Fornari reassured his readers that the mobilization of the psychological factors of war requires the intervention of specific historical realities. At the same time, Fornari insisted that investigations into social phenomena that separate social facts from the concrete individuals who form the society are obscurantist and lend a pseudoscientific pretext to the renunciation of responsibility. In Fornari's theory, and I'm just going to try to summarize this part really quickly because I don't think it's that important for us, but it's important to know the general outline. In Fornari's theory, war mobilizes unconscious anxieties and conflicts that, as Klein taught, spring from the major role played by aggression in infantile mental life. For Klein, the infant's rudimentary ego experiences conflict between loving and destructive impulses, conflict experienced in relation to external objects such as the mother's breast, which, as the infant's first love object, stands for the principle of the outside world. Terrified by its internal destructiveness, which it believes will destroy the love object, the infant rids itself of the terror by means of the unconscious mechanisms of splitting and projection. Splitting the external world into good objects and bad objects, the infant projects its own destructiveness into the bad ones, which it experiences as persecutory and destructive of the love object. Building on Freud's notion that early stages of mental life are available to the adult psyche, Fornari argued that the individual subject's projection of its internal terror, and Fornari calls this the internal terrifier, that the projection of the internal terrifier onto external enemies operates in war. Only in adult life, the love object that needs protection is a group or nation. Projection, motivated by terror and love, allows us to express aggressiveness without guilt. As a result, war defends people against anxieties about internal enemies by finding real enemies to kill. But, said Fornari, with the advent of the nuclear situation, war enters a state of crisis, ceasing to operate as a defense because nuclear war destroys the love object along with the enemy. With regard to the question I'm raising here, the question of responsibility, the most important part of Fornari's theory is his idea that the individual subject gets rid of its violence, which is prohibited by law, by investing or alienating it in the state, the social institution that monopolizes violence. And he talks about the state as a kind of bank, and people invest their violence there. Fornari wanted to return war to the subject in order to rouse individuals from their alienation in the state and thereby motivate them to take responsibility for war. I deem it important to insist on the thesis that in tracing the war phenomenon to the unconscious of each man, we arrive at considering each man responsible for war, he wrote. And in a passage that Wojcicki spotlights in his book, The Abolition of War, Fornari continued, "It is we ourselves who desire war, and the alienation of our aggressiveness into the state serves us simply to be able to say that it is not we who desire war, but that the state forces us to make war. In this manner, we convince ourselves that the state is responsible for war in order not to feel responsible for it ourselves. To escape from our alienation in the state, therefore, means to be personally responsible for war, just as we feel personally responsible for inter-individual crimes." Taking responsibility for abolishing war, then, begins with taking responsibility for war, which is one and the same act as taking responsibility for the unconscious. In turn, taking responsibility for the unconscious means tolerating what Freud taught us, that in our unconscious, as Mignon Nixon has remarked, we are very bad. And so, to take responsibility for the unconscious is to embrace what has been called a courageously disillusioned Freudian politics. It is a central tenet of psychoanalysis, says Jacqueline Rose, that if we can tolerate what is most disorienting, disillusioning about our own unconscious, we are less likely to act on it, less inclined to strike out in a desperate attempt to assign the horrors of the world to somewhere or someone else. It is not the aggressive impulse that is dangerous, but the ruthlessness of our attempts to be rid of it. In an uncharacteristic moment, Wojcicki writes that unwar projects will eventually turn, and this is a quote, "our formerly bloody, self-destructive minds into a thing of the past and make our souls war-free." In making this promise, he turns away from the psychoanalytic principles he otherwise espouses, for in reality, as Freud said, there is no such thing as eradicating psychic violence. Recognizing such psychic facts is the psychoanalytic stand. So naive idealism, the charge leveled at those who want to abolish war, inheres not in working for a world without war, but rather in failing to face the difficulty of the goal, a difficulty that arises because opposition to abolishing war comes not only from others, but also has its roots in ourselves. Yet today, in an era of perpetual war and sexualized torture, intellectuals on the left often refuse responsibility for the unconscious, expressing the belief that psychoanalytic ideas about subjectivity and violence are distractions from politics. In this manner, some anti-war leftists may worry that reflecting on individual responsibility will automatically divert attention from the need for collective action. For those whose anti-war politics is courageously disillusioned, however, the reverse has been the case. Precisely because we are warlike, they argue, a less violent world requires the establishment of new social institutions and, in particular, international institutions. Consider, to begin with, Immanuel Kant's 1795 pre-Freudian essay, Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, one of the earliest modern proposals for an international peacemaking institution. Kant believed that, quote, the warlike inclination of those in power, the savagery of European and American states is integral to human nature. Quote, a state of peace among men living together is not the same as the state of nature, which is rather a state of war. What he elsewhere called radical evil, a wickedness of the human heart that cannot be gotten rid of and that is displayed on the level of the state in war, makes peace difficult, and thus, Kant concluded, the state of peace must be formally instituted. Kant's reasoning about the relationship between evil and social institutions applies equally if we view war psychoanalytically. Because of our ineradicable badness, our unconscious aggressivity, unwar must be socially instituted. Fornari said as much, quote, the purpose of the psychoanalytic disclosure of the individual responsibility for war is to prepare the ground for new social institutions which would allow the individual concretely to express his responsibility on the politico-social level. If it is I who am responsible, it is I who must make amends. But if I must make amends, I must have concrete political instruments through which my reparative wishes may be concretely expressed. Believing that the responsibility for unconscious wishes can become a social force, Fornari proposed such a reparative political instrument, one he named the Omega Institution. Integrating individual forces into social reality was the purpose of the institution, to which I'll return in a moment. So the next section of my talk is called Cosmopolitics. In designing the World Institute for the Abolition of War, Krzysztof Wodiczko becomes heir to the modern legacy of international peacemaking, placing his work within the field of cosmopolitan politics, or as it is sometimes called, cosmopolitics. Modern cosmopolitanism, an embattled term going back to the 18th century, encompasses a variety of moral and political views and is currently the object of a lot of debate. I use the term here to refer to a global political consciousness that, though not necessarily post-nationalist, responds to the suffering of those who live beyond its own geographic and cultural borders, and is adversarial in relation to global patriarchy and capitalist cosmopolitanism, which is what Marx called exploitation on a world scale through a global mode of production. Equally contentious is cosmopolitanism's correlative term, universalism. By contrast with depoliticizing, generalizing universalisms that cast differences and particularities into privacy and constitute one aspect of Enlightenment thought, universalism can also name a practice dedicated to extending the demand for justice and equality, which was another facet of the Enlightenment. The demand for justice requires, in Etienne Balibar's words, the affirmation of a universal right to politics, to, that is, question the social order. Joan Kopchak advocates this second Enlightenment universalism in a superb essay on radical evil. The Kantian universal, she writes, is neither an underlying principle that informs individual beings nor a superior instance that subsumes our particularity. It is rather the focal point of our actions, end quote. Kant, focused on perpetual peace, believed that the only rational way to bring it about was by establishing an international state. Realizing, however, that at the time such a state was not the will of nations, he proposed a negative substitute, a federation of nations that would create a system of international law based on principles of right. For his part, Fornari, influenced by Bertrand Russell's belief that a single world government is the only alternative to the extinction of the human race, but, like Kant, envisioning obstacles to its formation, emphatically rejected Kant's substitute, a union of states, an organization like the United Nations, in which each member nation is above all jealous of preserving its own sovereignty. World government, Fornari insisted, presupposes the abolition of state sovereignty, but who will abolish it? Arguing that the abolition of sovereignty from above by international agreements between nations only arouses persecution and castration anxieties that lead to heightened vindictiveness on the part of nations, Fornari maintained that state sovereignty must be abolished from below, when individual citizens reappropriate the violence they've invested in this. When individual citizens reappropriate the violence they've alienated in the state, take back the violence. In so doing, individuals do not themselves become violent or exonerate the state's violence, but rather take responsibility for war by withdrawing their consent to, protesting against state violence. Returning to the subject, then, is the starting point for the sovereign state to evolve toward the non-sovereign state, one subject to the same laws as its citizens. And returning to the subject is also the foundation of Fornari's peacemaking institution, the Omega Institution, which is a national judicial institution designed to inaugurate the evolution toward non-sovereignty by establishing laws prohibiting the nation's aggression against other groups and instituting penalties for the exportation of violence. The Omega Institution detoxifies national cultures and group identities, paving the way to world government. Wediczko's World Institute for the Abolition of War diverges from more classical paradigms of international peacemaking, because unlike Kant's and Fornari's proposal, it makes no reference to world government and is not grounded in the model of the nation state. Instead, it stresses multilateral, non-governmental alliances, such as the Discursive Forum for the Abolition of War and the Cross-Disciplinary Center for Global Peace Projects. World Institute, then, participates in the construction of a new cosmopolitics, one responsive to Derrida's exhortation to cultivate the spirit of the cosmopolitan tradition by questioning its limits and adjusting it to our own time. For Derrida, this means, among other things, recognizing that justice is not fully exercised within the framework of the nation state or the boundaries of law, that the law cannot encompass ethical life. No doubt Wediczko, like Derrida, supports international law, but World Institute is neither a lawmaking nor a judicial institution. It is rather an institution of the public sphere, promoting critical speech and democratic agonistic discourse. And unlike previous peacemaking proposals, World Institute is a cultural institution aiming to dismantle the culture of war and institutionalize a transnational unwar culture. The project thus challenges the oft-expressed notion that emotional ties, identifications, and shared responsibilities can only be forged on local, and national levels. Bruce Robbins notes that, quote, though the concept of culture emerged historically in close connection with nationalism, it does not belong inevitably or definitively on the side of nation, inheritance, or locality, end quote. The reason that, although, sorry. The reason, something's wrong with my text, but although throughout most of human history, both habitual knowledge of others and habitual opportunities to affect others' lives were very limited in space, now social organizations and communication technologies have expanded, and along with them, possibilities for international common culture and modes of belonging. To realize such a possibility, Deutsche mobilizes the most highly sophisticated communication and information technologies to create an anti-war instance of what Robbins calls global feeling. World Institute, then, exemplifies what Robbins has more recently called a newer cosmopolitanism, which, in the wake of the localizing, pluralizing tendency of certain new cosmopolitanisms of the 1990s, reconsiders the virtues of cosmopolitanism's universalist impulse and makes it a priority to oppose the military aggression of one's own country, especially that of the United States. In the preface to Perpetual Peace, Kant remarks on the practical politician's condescending attitude toward political theorists. The worldly wise statesman, he writes, believes that the theorist is a mere academic who cannot endanger the state. It thus follows, he concludes, that if the practical politician is to be consistent, he must not claim, in the event of a dispute with the theorist, to sense any danger to the state in the opinions which the theorist has randomly uttered in public. By this saving clause, the author, and this is still Kant, by this saving clause, the author of this essay will consider himself expressly safeguarded in correct and proper style against all malicious interpretation. Kant casts himself as a hopeless idealist, detached from practical matters, trading in fantasies, the role that, as I said at the beginning of my talk, is frequently assigned to those who assume responsibility for abolishing war. Kant's preface is ironic, however, because, as Alan Wood writes, Kant actually rejected the notion that historical hopes must never be entertained, as though we could not devote ourselves to final ends of humanity unless we see clear signs that humanity is on the brink of fulfilling them. World Institute for the Abolition of War makes clear that the same is true of Deutsche, who, in a time of perpetual war, allows the historical hope of unwar to enter the public space of appearances, establishing it as a reality.